Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Jayne Malenfant. They are an assistant professor in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University. Jayne's areas of interest are community-led research, educational and housing justice, and anarchist social justice education. Their current research focuses on the educational experiences of young people and adults navigating homelessness, the engagement of people with lived and living experience of housing precarity in advocacy and research, and the experiences of two-spirit, trans, and non-binary communities navigating housing precarity and institutional inaccess. Jayne, hello.
Hello, Paul.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Your work sounds like it's very important, and a lot of people would need the results of your research and the ideas you come up with. Could you tell us a little more about what you do?
Sure. So I am a community-based researcher. I do a lot of participatory research, mostly institutional ethnographies with different communities, but mostly communities that are engaging in activism or some form of resistance against educational and housing rights violations and injustice. And a lot of my work focuses on working across communities of young people and adults who are navigating these kinds of pathways of precarity.
These issues that you raise, are they rampant across the country?
Yeah, so a lot of my work is working on what communities are saying are the most pressing issues. And a lot of communities that I work with, especially gender diverse communities, are navigating the housing crisis. And so a lot of my work tries to respond to these calls from policymakers to find solutions to homelessness that we're seeing more and more in our communities, but also listening to what communities want those solutions to look like.
Is it true, because I read somewhere once, that a lot of our homeless youth come from the LGBTQ plus community, and a lot of them just face a lot of discrimination, so they end up on the streets. And then when you're on the streets, you have all sorts of challenges that come your way. Is that a correct assessment or understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of my work starts in my own experiences. I was a queer youth. I experienced homelessness, and that came with a lot of disengagement from school and other accesses to social supports. And we see this a lot with queer and trans young people. Depending on the studies, some studies estimate that they're over 100% more likely to experience homelessness than cis or straight youth. And we see that the pathways into homelessness for these communities are different, and it's often because they're pushed out of their homes because of transphobia or homophobia. And so while I didn't begin working with this community, the fact that I come from this community means that I've kind of been drawn to working with young people who identify that way or adults who identify that way, and because they're overrepresented in populations experiencing homelessness.
You're now an assistant professor at McGill University. That's a sharp change in your destiny or in your life path. How did you manage to take charge of your life, if I could use those words?
Yeah, so I'm now an assistant professor in a faculty of education. I start this work thinking of my past, where I was kicked out of high school because I was experiencing homelessness. And at the time, I really thought it was my own fault that I wasn't participating in school the right way, but I always loved school. And so the fact that I'm now still in school and working around schools isn't super surprising, but a lot of my work now looks at the things that helped me. So I was helped by peers who were also navigating the same thing. I was helped by family and community that were navigating barriers that, weren't necessarily our fault, but that we were having to contend with to find stability. And so now a lot of my work looks at how education in particular can be a way for people to find stability, to do what they love in life instead of kind of being cut out of these institutions. And how schools can be a place of support instead of a place where, you're kind of pushed out and said you don't belong here, which is what happened to me.
Do you think your vision has changed drastically about how you view the world and life in general? Or would you say it's an evolution and you're still the same Jayne that you were a few years ago or several years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think of that a lot if now having a role as an assistant professor in, a university like McGill has changed how I enter the work. And I think at my core, I still have the same ethic. That's why I love doing community-based research. That's why I love working in solidarity with community organizers and non-academics to do research that matters to them, because I got into this work to make sense of my own reality and to learn about the systems and histories that were organizing my life. And so I love bringing young people and adults who are navigating these things into research spaces so that they can make use of them. So I think I approach the work in the same way, and the things that I find valuable are the things that helped me when I was experiencing homelessness. And so I think I have different access and different resources now, but I think my approach is kind of the same.
And does that help you to connect with youth who are homeless, or do they see you as part of the system or the structure, or are you an entry point into combating or surviving the system or the structure?
It's a complicated position, I think. So particularly when I was a student and I was maybe closer in age to a lot of the youth I was working with, they saw me as a peer, but also saw, that I was doing it my own way. I wasn't having to change the way I spoke or the way I presented myself. Now I do think I speak differently and I present myself a bit differently than maybe when I was like a teenager or in my early 20s. And I think young people have said, you've shown us what we could access in a way we never thought we could. Maybe we can go back to post-secondary. Maybe we can be in these positions like a university professor. But they've also seen that I can critique those structures as well, that I want schools to do better. I want us to be able to build different systems to support them through research. So it's this parallel kind of position where I think I represent something that relates to their experiences, but I also am coming in with access and knowledge that is different than theirs. But that's the cool part, I think, when we can put those in conversation with each other.
It's very fascinating. I want to ask you, I have so many questions, but the one I'm going to ask you now is, what are the stumbling blocks? Because you mentioned just now that students look at you and then they realize that they can do things differently. So what is happening, or what blocks them from thinking that they deserve better or they can do better?
In my research in particular, kind of themes across different young people have emerged in their educational trajectories in particular. Young people who experience homelessness, and there's a lot of different youth, and everyone looks a little different. But overall, we've seen that schools kind of imagine one type of student, and that student often is kind of middle class, white, able-bodied, usually not trans, usually not queer. And so when students don't fit that mold, even if they're not being told they don't belong, they're being told through hidden and insidious ways. And so another way that young people feel like they can't belong in schools is that they just try to ask for help and they're not believed. I think schools imagine that young people will follow a particular trajectory, and if youth aren't doing that, or if they're encountering, curricula that is against kind of their lived experiences or their cultural backgrounds, it can become this point of contention. And I don't think schools right now are very good at reconciling those things. So young people will often say, well, I don't trust this institution, or this isn't for me, and so they'll choose to leave. But what we can see through the research is these are structural barriers and systemic barriers. And so young people experiencing homelessness are less likely to be treated as if they would even attend post-secondary, as if that's even an option available to them. So their options are usually limited from a really young age. It happened to me too. It was like, well, you're never going to go to university, so why would we even waste our time talking to you about your options there? And I think these kinds of limitations can be really problematic, for young people. And often when they experience homelessness, there's just a disengagement immediately. Schools don't see that as a place for them to be acting. So a lot of my research tries to bridge kind of organizations that work with homeless youth and institutions.
That's interesting. Would the main factor be what schools portray or project onto those young students? Or are there also factors like home life, like the parents? I guess it's more complex, but one of the main factors would be what the school represents and says an ideal or model citizen is.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Even the curriculum that we have, what it says about who the ideal citizen is. There's also a couple other things I think in play. So home life can be really important. And like I mentioned, for trans and queer youth, sometimes that's a place where they can't really be themselves. But schools increasingly are also not safe places for a lot of trans and queer youth around the country because of policies where they can't use their preferred pronouns or names. But ultimately, I think there needs to be a better connection between home life and institutions like schools or healthcare. And often what we see now, the only reaction to seeing a young person who might be at risk of homelessness is to call child welfare. And we know in Canada, child welfare is really problematic in terms of policing Indigenous families, Black families, poor families. And so really, I think we need better responses that see young people as part of family and community differently.
One last question before we move to history. Was there a defining moment in your own pathway where you realized that you needed to change or things needed to change? Or what was the trigger that led to, I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that there was a change that happened. Was there a defining moment or experience that pushed you to saying, wait a second, I will help my peers and I think I can do it?
Yeah, I've been asked this question before, and I don't think that there was a moment. I think actually while I was precariously housed, I was already helping my peers. Like we were kids learning how to survive the circumstances we were navigating and learning how to access what we needed. And I had, I still was lucky enough to have a connection to my family. I had resources at my disposal that I could use. But I think, thinking back on it, I actually think research has allowed me to make sense of my own history in relation to my family, my communities, in a way that was really helpful, where I was kind of in survival mode. Even after I was housed, I was very precariously housed, even when I came to McGill to do my PhD. So I had been couch surfing during my master's. And so there wasn't really a point where I all of a sudden was stable. But once I became more stable, I was able to reflect on what had happened and what I saw as helping me and my peers, and can now look at that with young people I work with today in my research to say, look at what you're doing to survive. Like, that's amazing. Can we try to think through how we can mobilize that in research to, change how schools respond or the state responds to homelessness?
So you were in a precarious living situation, but you still had certain privileges.
Yes.
That other homeless youth probably didn't or don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that was maybe one of the factors that helped you, quote unquote, keep on track. It's hard to use those terms.
No, I think that's accurate. I can think of instances, I grew up in my teens in Saskatchewan, and I'm white, and my peers were facing disproportionate, punitive measures by police officers, for example. So we can see that trajectories of young people and adults through homelessness do depend on your positionality and how you're perceived by police officers, teachers, social workers, healthcare workers. It makes a big difference.
Do a lot of homeless youth have hope, or have they lost hope?
I think homeless youth have so much hope. I love working with young people because the conversations we have about the changes that are possible are so much more fruitful. They have so much hope for radical change. They don't say, this is how life is, so it has to stay this way. We just have to, try to work with what we've got. They're saying tear down the systems that oppress us. The kinds of solutions that young people come up with that they're seeing and implementing in their lives, in their peer groups on the street, are really rad. And so I find it really inspiring. I think that they know firsthand why the system that they're operating in doesn't work for them. So they are way more into thinking of alternatives that just imagine housing justice, educational justice, community. So yeah, it's very, very hopeful work.
So deep thinkers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's amazing. So what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? And why do you think that image comes to mind?
It's interesting we're talking about my trajectory and getting kicked out of high school, because this question brings up for me when I think of history, the first thing that comes up is a history class I had in high school, like months before I got kicked out. And I got kicked out of high school because I wasn't showing up because I was homeless. But I had this history teacher who saw me, and he, I went from being a straight A student to not really showing up, and my grades were slipping. I wasn't interested. And his approach was, I'm going to get you really into World War II, and I'm going to get you to watch Patton and get you really into military stuff. And I remember thinking, that's really nice, but this isn't necessarily a history that speaks to me or my experiences. I could tell he was trying, but because of where he was coming at it from, he just couldn't think that perhaps this wasn't the most effective way to keep me engaged. And sure enough, within a couple of months, I was brought into the principal's office and told I wasn't welcome to attend anymore. And then I think the next year I ended up going to an adult education and alternative education school, and the history class there was completely different. We had a professor, and this was in Saskatchewan, who was teaching us about Louis Riel and the Métis resistance, and I was just really there for it. I was like, okay, perfect. This is history that speaks to me. I can get on board with this. This is it's mobilized in a way that was different. And when you asked this question, I was thinking of these two classrooms and the way that history can speak to something inside of us or some kind of experience that compels us or really alienates us. So yeah, I think that first came up because, when we think of history, we often think of history within the context of curriculum and classrooms as our entry point, maybe academically, I guess. But yeah, so those two things come up as varying approaches to teaching history.
It's very interesting. So would this be your earliest memory of your connection to history, or do you have an earlier memory when you were younger?
I think this is where I start losing grip in my own mind of what history is, because I can think of capital H history, maybe of something I learned in, a secondary school classroom. But my earliest memory of history that I can think of is speaking with my grandmother at such an early age that I couldn't even comprehend that she wasn't always an old woman. And she was telling me about, growing up and living in the bush and things being very different than what I was experiencing as a young person. I'm from Kapuskasing, Ontario, and she grew up outside of town, and so was telling me what it was like for her as a young girl to be going about her daily life and being on the farm or working with her parents. And I couldn't even comprehend such a different life at that time, but it was through her telling me her own history that I started learning the history of my family and the history of the place we were living. And so for me, the earliest memories of history are not to do with school at all, are just conversations with family members.
Did anything specific stand out from those conversations? 'Cause you talked about how you learned about the land, about your family, but was there a specific situation or event or memory that struck you?
I think just connecting place with history, knowing that we could walk through the woods, but those were also similar woods that she was walking through when she was younger and that her mom was walking through. I think that's an entry point for history that we can, I could really sink my teeth into and could situate where we were physically walking. And so if I think back to kind of the first memory, I didn't feel that when I was learning about General Patton, although it's important to learn about things that aren't immediately related to you perhaps, but it was a way of entering into thinking of the place we were and the land we were on in a different way, obviously also with different histories of relationships to that land, but it also allowed me to see my place in relation to where we were at.
Would she talk about the changing landscape?
Yeah, and I think part of it was also to recognize what I had afforded to me as a young person compared to what she was able to access when she was a girl in terms of, gender for one thing, and what roles were expected of her versus what was expected of me and the kind of more openness, but also a lot of early discussions with both of my all of my grandparents were around, what does it mean to live in abject poverty or poverty where you don't really have access to things. And at that point, I had access to a lot of things. So I think the kind of structural pieces that I was speaking about at the start were evident in the stories that they were telling.
Wow, so interesting. Could you please describe a moment in time, an episode, or an incident in your professional or everyday life where you had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a goal or making positive change, social change through your work? And what was your justification for using history?
I'd like to share one example, and I think it has the same kind of vibe as learning from my grandmother because it's all conversational. And I think I've taken that approach to learning about history in all of my work. I ask people, where do you come from, or how did you learn about this thing? And so last year I was working on a project that was funded by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate with other folks who were trans, gender diverse, non-binary, or two-spirit, and we were trying to look at housing rights for these communities. And so going back to kind of the work that I introduced at the outset, but we got together and we started talking, like, how did you start doing this work? Everyone kind of worked in and around housing advocacy, and people started talking about their families and their pasts. And so what was supposed to be kind of a pretty straightforward lit review ended up turning into this zine that outlined histories of our different communities. And we had one collaborator, Charlotte, who is Métis, and was talking about the history of Métis and First Nations people of petitioning the government for change, for justice, and them often not listening, but that act of resistance was important anyway. And Jody and Alex, my other collaborators, were talking about the resistance of queer people throughout history that has changed things to lead to LGBTQ plus rights. Pride starting as a riot, the leadership of trans Black women, and thinking through how we could look to the past to be thinking of how to survive and assure rights in the present, but also like these radical imaginations for a future grounded in histories. And we had to justify that by saying that this was our natural process. When we got together and started asking each other things, what came out was that we were all talking about how inspiring histories in our communities could be to show us that we shouldn't take injustice lying down, that we could be resisting even if the systems around us didn't seem to have us in mind or want to be taking care of us, that we could be taking care of each other. And so the team we were working with was actually really on board once we proposed it. And they also said, well, think of, how even human rights mechanisms come from history. And we fought really hard to get these protections that theoretically apply to everyone. And so how does that link into the histories you're talking about? And so it wasn't an obvious choice, but it was a natural choice. And that once we started getting together, it wasn't necessarily traditional research, but we were all telling histories of different communities that we were a part of and that inspired us to do this work.
It's interesting because history for you seems to have a deep connection to different lives and different life trajectories. And there's an interesting relationship that exists. What would you say history is? Is there a definition that you could give?
Yeah, good question. I think that's it. I think for me, history is a relationship. I think it's our relationship to people, but also structures. And so in that project, for example, we did talk about individual people, and we came from all different parts of the territories known as Canada. So we were talking about different histories of people, but we were also talking about different histories of institutions. And so I think history is always a relationship with people throughout time and space, but it also tells us something about the history of how institutions have organized our lives and the state has responded to our work. And so I think history is something very fluid for me, and it's something very relational. And it's also something I begin knowing about in my own experiences always, because I think that's always how we know anything, but is something that we can learn more about as we talk to people. So even thinking through the issue of homelessness, my idea of what happened to me in my life was that it was an individual problem, but in research, looking at the histories of, the way social services have been structured in Canada, how other people have experienced homelessness, tells me something about the histories that have brought us to where we are today. So I think history is something relational and is also something actionable, which isn't a definition, but is something.
It is something. But what I find interesting is, based on what you just said, history is something that can liberate someone, but that can also confine or control someone. So there's this interesting dynamic happening. And I remember you talking about anarchy, and that's part of your own research project. And Anarchy sounds really cool, but is there a connection between your understanding of anarchy and history?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's also always underlying what I'm doing. So, yeah, the other piece of my work that's always there is understanding histories of resistance against the state in particular. And I think within anarchist approaches and methodologies, there's also a rejection of one kind of narrative or one idea of what has happened. And so to say, okay, well, we have history books and they tell us something about how someone wanted to tell this story, but we also know things in our own experience that tell us something about history. And it's most exciting when we can build that together, and that's collective work, and that we don't have to take for granted what the state is telling us history is. And so, whether that's in curriculum or otherwise, we can be questioning that and critiquing that and sometimes subverting that in really cool ways.
Could I ask you what you think anarchy is?
Yeah, I think anarchy is difficult to define. And I think the idea of what anarchy is often that it's chaos. But for me, what I take from anarchism is that it can be many things, that actually I try to reject defining it in one way, but that it overall is against unjust hierarchies. So hierarchies that are based in injustices and, rights violations, maybe not framed that way, but something that's based on an unfair power dynamic, and also is focused on mutual aid and direct action. So the other piece of that being that we don't have to be relying on the state for care or for change or transformation, that we can do it together right now. So for me, history is an important part of that, because if we don't know what has happened, it's difficult to plan how to act today. And anarchy also tells us that we can act today. We're never powerless to change the realities that we're living in. So yeah, I think that it asks us to think of multiple histories as we're thinking of organizing for social change.
That's interesting. So you talk about the multiple histories, but there's one type of action ultimately, fundamentally, that can take place?
I think there's lots of types of actions, but I think within anarchism, the idea is that it's direct action. So we're not necessarily going to be advocating for a policy change that's going to come in, 3 years from now when the state decides that it's okay enough to be implemented. The idea is that, you and I sitting here today, we can be acting differently. So we can be changing the structure of how we socialize and relate to each other immediately. Even thinking of history differently can be an action in itself. So I think there's many actions within that, but that they're all focusing on our power and our experience as a starting point for doing different actions.
What's interesting is that you've touched upon both, I guess, individual and more broader collective sides of history through your discussion. Is there a difference when history is done at an individual level and when history is done at a collective level? Like you talked about stories that your grandmother shared with you and how that was foundational, but that also helped you somehow be ready to face the structures and to try to counter them as best as you could or can today. Is there a difference, or what is the relationship when it comes to the individual and the collective and history's power, I guess?
Yeah, I think the collective is somewhere I'm really interested in. I think is also a place where research and education can be really fruitful. But I also think the collective is always made up of individual histories in relation with each other. So to me, they're always necessarily entwined. And I'm always a bit wary when we collectively present one version of history as the version of history. Even if we've collectively created that version, there's always going to be other perspectives that tell us something more about what has happened. So to me, I think they're always speaking to one another. And I actually think a really cool thing in anarchist and activist education that I do with homeless youth, but also in my research broadly, is examining narratives or examining historical policies or examining things that have happened in our society together to say, this is what the kind of dominant narrative is. How have you experienced this? And so I think history, if it's treated as something that is always individual and collective and also always moving and interactive, that's when it becomes a really useful tool to understand action today.
So based on what you've said, is history a good thing, or can it also be a bad thing?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I think that history is always many things. I think that history can be mobilized as this relationship that we have with time and space and different people and systems in good ways and in bad ways. But I think we're always shaping it. So I would be hesitant to describe it in any way that it would be able to be kind of an object rather than a relationship. And I think when history is presented in a way that erases some of our experiences, which I think it often is in kind of state curriculum, or it's one version of history that's presented, it can be a starting point for resistance as well. And so even when history might be seen as negative in that it doesn't include all of our histories, it can also be a point where people say, actually, no, here is my history and here's my version of it. So I don't think that it's ever all bad. I think there's always some good things that can come from any presentation of what history is.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I think that I've never thought this much about history as a topic, but in answering these questions, it's made me reflect more on how prevalent talking about histories and time is in my work. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. There's just one lingering question that I have, and I love your fluid understanding of history. At the same time, the work that you engage in, would you say, is it ideological? So I'm trying to see how you navigate that, the ideological side of anarchy-based work or the work you do, and the fluidity of history that you repeatedly defined or mentioned.
I don't know. I feel like my work is always grounded in the experiences of people. And I think, I draw on Dorothy Smith and I do institutional ethnography. I think I actually try quite hard to avoid imposing an ideology on what I'm doing. And so all of the things I've discussed today, the conversations we had about history came out of us just being in a room together and asking each other, about our experiences and our knowledge from our work professionally, our lived experiences. And so I think that I would say no, in that I would like to think that I'm not fitting things into an ideological box, but I'm using anarchism and, conceptions of history as tools to make sense of the work that I'm already doing with people, and that work is also always historical, but not in a way that imposes history on our experiences.
Jayne Malenfant, thank you so much.
Thank you.